Russia has focused its efforts on capturing two Ukrainian cities, Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. At the same time, it has reduced the intensity of attacks in the direction of Kostiantynivka. This is reported by analysts from the Institute for the Study of War. Russian troops are conducting offensive operations in Pokrovsk and its outskirts. With the aim of capturing it, analysts are observing enemy advances in the southeast of the city. Ukrainian forces are launching counterattacks in the north and conducting operations to clear out sabotage groups. However, this does not significantly affect control over Pokrovsk, since there are already too many occupiers in the city and its outskirts, according to military experts. Moreover, the enemy has likely deprioritized offensive operations in this tactical direction in favor of the Kostiantynivka-Drushkivka direction, specifically the completion of the capture of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. Currently, Russian assault troops are searching for routes to bypass Ukrainian strongpoints and are infiltrating into the rear. Meanwhile, enemy drone or artillery crews are working to destroy Ukrainian fortifications. On the maps of the Deep State Monitoring Project, all of Pokrovsk is still marked as a gray zone, but the top military leadership of Ukraine assures that Pokrovsk and Mirnograd are holding on. The enemy has thrown all its forces at Pokrovsk, but has slowed its advance due to the resistance of the defense forces. There are currently assault groups there. Special operations forces and the National Guard are trying to clear out residential neighborhoods where the Russians have infiltrated in order to open the way for our infantry. They are still holding the southern outskirts, also destroying enemy pilot launch points. At the end of the week, Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky stated that reinforcements for our forces were arriving in the city. Footage appeared on social media showing the landing of the National Guard paratroopers from helicopters that had touched down, practically right under the enemy's nose. There were several photos of the head of the Main Intelligence Directorate, Kirilo Budanov, who also arrived in Donetsk region. And in one of the photos published by Syrsky, the chief intelligence officer is seen coordinating with all units of the defense forces. Pokrovsk itself has already become a battlefield, and the defense forces are still conducting counteractions there. At the same time, the General Staff refuted Putin's claims about an alleged blockade of Pokrovsk and the neighboring Mirnograd. Although that is exactly the plan the Russians have. Pokrovsk
and Mirnograd. Let's start with this topic. The hottest direction on the front line. President Zelensky recently stated that Russia has concentrated about 170,000 troops in this direction. Fierce fighting. We are all closely monitoring the changes every hour. Is it possible to understand the objective situation here, considering the difficulty is not just in obtaining information from there, but sometimes even for the military? Understanding on the ground who is where right now, because the kill zone is currently as wide as the city itself. What is happening there? How can we understand it?
What is happening there is the systematic attrition of the enemy, and we need to understand that. Overall, looking at the bigger picture, Pokrovsk is not some separate section of the front line. And what exactly? All the enemy's forces, which he had promised back in the spring would be used to advance along the entire front, are now concentrated in the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd agglomeration. That is, starting from the Sumy region, where he said he would reach Sumy, then Kupiansk, where he was supposed to capture Kupiansk, Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, and then move on towards Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. So all of this entire front has now been reduced to a single point, Pokrovsk. And as long as our defense forces are holding him there, he is unable to expand to a greater distance, to a larger front. And the more of the enemy that remains there, the more of us survive and endure. Accordingly, the more that coefficient will be in our favor, and that is the coefficient of war. And these indicators are actually the most important ones, not, let's say, kilometers.
But Yevhen also mentioned what President Zelensky said right before the weekend, didn't he? About the fact that there are about 170,000 troops there. Who are they? Are they super-trained assault troops who know what urban combat is and will effectively resist us? Who is concentrated there now?
Indeed, there are units of both the Marine Corps and the Air Assault Forces concentrated there. They also have their own Army Special Forces, their Special Operations Forces. That's why we are responding symmetrically on our side. That is, we are using not only infantry, not only paratroopers. For example, the 7th Air Assault Corps is excellent there. They are constantly working, clearing territories of the enemy. But we are also deploying our special forces, meaning special forces from the Main Intelligence Directorate, the Special Operations Forces, and the Security Service of Ukraine. So in fact, Pokrovsk today, this whole Pokrovsk-Mirnivka area, this point, it is such a focal point. Efforts are being made by both sides. However, what's interesting is that the enemy has allocated as many as 2 entire armies, the 2nd and the 51st Combined Arms Armies, to capture this territory. And that's why Putin is saying that supposedly he has already encircled Pokrovsk and that supposedly you can allow journalists in or some other nonsense like that. And it's precisely because, as a result of the summer offensive campaign, this 51st Combined Arms Army was supposed to come from the north, that is, from the northeast, and cut off all the other units, the formations. And this is what was reported to Putin by Gerasimov. And now this encirclement has not happened. And now Putin has ended up in a mess, because this is exactly what he was selling to both Trump and Xi Jinping. And today, instead of supposedly achieving an encirclement and having to reward the commander of this 51st Army, Putin is actually removing him from his post. He is removing him and a whole number of other officers as well, precisely because they failed to encircle Pokrovsk, which, as I said, was supposed to happen before the end of summer.
And what could change after this replacement of local commanders that he is carrying out? Will Putin, will Russia increase its pressure, boost its numbers, or, on the contrary, perhaps lose some offensive potential because changing commanders during active combat still requires time for adaptation and orientation? What could happen?
I wouldn't say that the replacement of any individual, even the commander-in-chief in such a large-scale war as ours, would have any significant impact. I mean, of course, in small wars with limited participants, I mean tens, a few, 10,000 or more people. But when we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, that's a huge war. And once the machinery of war is set in motion, no individual names will really change these advances. That is, the enemy's plans. So I wouldn't count on a change of personnel as something that would be a significant factor in this war. As of today, the situation around Pokrovsk is 50-50. And it's difficult and dynamic. These might sound like overused phrases. But in reality, neither we nor the enemy can tip the balance. At the moment, the scales can't be tipped, even though the enemy's advantage is not just 6 to 8 times, but 10 to 12 times. That is, if we're talking about specific units on the ground, and what our forces are doing in Pokrovsk and its surroundings. These are truly not only masterpieces of military skill, but also of our success, because we can see their losses today in the daily reports. And it's not just infantry there anymore. There are tanks, there are armored fighting vehicles. In other words, the entire arsenal of the Russian army is present. There, and in other places as well, of course, our defense forces are also being buried.
Well, and on our side, there were even Black Hawk aircraft from the elite special units of the Main Intelligence Directorate. And in what situations are such aircraft specifically used? Was this the first time? These are American, really top-class military machines, right?
Well, here I wouldn't count on any particularly special role for these helicopters. It really is an excellent machine, I mean, an excellent helicopter for landing troops. However, 2 such helicopters, that's, overall, we're talking about around 20 people. 20 people, and against those 200 or even 20,000 involved, of course, you can't really do anything. But the way the soldiers on the front lines reacted right away was excellent. They know that everyone is with them, including the special forces of the Main Intelligence Directorate. So their spirits were immediately lifted, the very spirit the Russians are trying to break. That's why they immediately launched this disinformation campaign, claiming that everyone there was wiped out, all the helicopters were shot down, and all the special forces were destroyed. Because they understand perfectly well that on our side, it is precisely spirit and will to fight that are essential elements. For our resilience,
what is happening on other sections of the front? In terms of information, all attention is focused on Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, but there is also enemy advancement at the junction of Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions. What is happening there?
Indeed, the Novopavlivka direction is also difficult, and the enemy will continue to advance. He has no other choice, because this is exactly that plain where he can gain kilometers and there are extra kilometers. And let me remind you, it is with these kilometers that things happen. This is what Putin reports on. That is, as of today, the Russian command has to somehow cover up the failure they've already experienced near Pokrovsk, regardless of whether Pokrovsk remains under our control or passes under Russian control, but this is already definite, a failure for the enemy, and these, so to speak, unfulfilled tasks. The enemy will try to compensate by advancing across the plains. So the situation there will, of course, be difficult, and our task is to build new lines of defense along those natural or industrial lines that will be advantageous for holding such a line. There's no point in digging trenches out in the open field, obviously. There are significantly fewer of us than the enemy. And in this regard, I would like to draw attention specifically to recruitment, because the ratio in numbers, the ratio in the manning of our units compared to the enemy's, well, it's certainly significant. We can see for ourselves the numbers vary, meaning for each specific unit it's 20 to 25% or even 50 to 60% on our side, while for the enemy it could be 80%. 95 to 95%. So we understand just how much of an advantage they have in terms of manning levels.
Well, right now we can see a QR code on our screen. The separate presidential brigade, yes, is looking for specialists. Who exactly are they looking for, and how can someone transfer and choose a specific unit for themselves?
Thank you very much for your support. Recruitment. And on this note, I would also like to urge all viewers, because we are used to donating to fundraisers, we are used to sharing and supporting our friends' campaigns. But when our friends, brothers in arms or relatives serve in a specific unit and they say, for example, that they lack drone operators or even something as basic as accountants or drivers, for some reason it becomes an obstacle for us to share this information and say, this is a good unit with good leadership, with great commanders, no one problematic there. They need this, that and the other, and to post this recruitment list. This kind of recruitment donation is, at times, even more important today than another Mavic drone, which is, of course, always needed. There is no such thing as too little weaponry, but it is precisely the shortage of people that is causing us to falter. A shortage of people means that personnel will be rotated less frequently at their positions. It means that the stretch of the front each individual has to hold will be wider, and as a result, each person will become more exhausted, leading to greater losses. So it turns out to be a paradox, but the higher the level of manning in a unit, the fewer losses it actually suffers.
Continuing on this topic, there is news that Russia has begun mobilizing men, 1855 across all the occupied territories of Ukraine. The Russians plan to send between 50,000 and 100,000 people to fight against Ukraine. This was stated by the Deputy Commander of the 3rd Army Corps of Kukarchuk. And
this happened after Putin included the southern district in the occupied region. It seems like things are going well for him. He's concentrating his forces. Right now, there are a lot of people in the Kupiansk direction, and he's sending 170,000 to Pokrovsk. It's a huge number. And
he also wants to mobilize Ukrainians, about 100,000 people who remain in the occupied territories. Is this a problem?
Well, any additional mobilization by the Russians is, of course, a problem. But why did this happen? Because even the most basic tasks set by the Russians are not being accomplished. And they've calculated, it's not difficult at all, both American and British researchers have calculated that if a snail were moving at its typical speed, it would already be somewhere in Poland by now. The Russians can't advance. And of course, even the pace of their advance, the very thing they pride themselves on from World War II, well, today their losses are even higher. Per kilometer advance, their losses are higher than those of Stalin's army, Zhukov's army, with all its inhumane methods. And even then, it suffered fewer losses than the Russians do today. That's why, of course, Putin will continue to mobilize. And he will primarily mobilize the population of the occupied territories. And this is yet another signal to all those who criticize the territorial recruitment centers, claiming that our mobilization is somehow inhumane. But let's look at what the alternative is. In other words, the alternative is total abuse. That is, Putin literally plans to drive the Ukrainian population from the occupied territories to slaughter. This is the alternative to the territorial recruitment centers and mobilization.
Russia not only uses people and sends them to war, but also launches missiles, high-precision weapons. Not always high precision, but nevertheless, we have to counter this. Our international partners are helping us. Germany has announced that it is providing us with additional air defense systems, Patriots. How much will this ease the work of our air defenses, and how much stronger will it make them? The air defense shield over Ukraine?
It's a very interesting point, because in reality, Germany's position has changed dramatically. Recently, they have already fulfilled their summer, July commitments regarding the Patriots. There aren't enough Patriots in the world to cover such a vast territory as Ukraine. Even Israel can't do it, and they have much more advanced, higher-class air and missile defense systems. And they still can't provide 100% coverage for such a small country. That's why we shouldn't rely solely on Patriots, besides the fact that the issue is really about the missiles themselves. We simply don't have enough of these high-quality, latest modification missiles that can quickly intercept ballistic threats. But what's interesting is that the Germans started to move as soon as things began to change. The position of the Americans. As soon as the Americans started producing, promising, and supplying weapons, The Germans immediately became more active as well, and suddenly they found their own supplies and began transferring them to us. But it is precisely the position of the Americans that is decisive today. And here an interesting example is that elections are approaching in America. And this nuclear, I would say, conservative environment, these MAGA representatives, religious representatives, are gradually beginning to understand and support for Ukraine is growing. And this, of course, is the result of our successful communication efforts, but also of our achievements. So, when people ask why we talk about some success with a missile, or why we announce that we've arrived here or there, that is precisely to change public opinion in the United States. This is very important, and every candidate will be guided by public opinion. And every congressman, every candidate for Congress in Washington, and also President Trump. Therefore, there is no doubt that weapons will be provided precisely because this is already a demand of the American voter.
And our responses look very good overall, namely the so-called deep and comprehensive sanctions that have been imposed against Russia.
Democratic drones.
Practically, yes. Every day, Russian oil refineries and some military facilities are burning in various places. Deep strikes. Does this also push for additional support for Ukraine and weaken Russia?
100%. And here, so to speak, amid the ongoing war, we don't notice how much the discourse itself has changed. In 2022, every strike, every act of sabotage we carried out in the Russian Federation was perceived as something wow, something incredible. Today, it has already become routine. That is, in 2022, at the beginning of the war, we could fight on our own territory, reclaim part of the Kharkiv region, part of the Kherson region, but under no circumstances could we, for example, touch their oil refineries. Today, we are already fighting strategically against the Russian Federation. Well, we've managed to reduce their oil industry by almost a third. That is an achievement. To reduce it by more than a third, and in general to drive their Black Sea fleet out, that's an achievement. 7 billion in losses just as a result of striking their strategic aviation. The whole world sees all of this. They already see Ukraine not as some country, as someone once said, without a map, but as a country that can and knows how to strike such a large nation. And all the main headlines should play a role on the map.
New approaches to delivering strikes, so we are waiting for these new maps. But even the insiders were left behind.
Absolutely, of course.
Serhiy Kuzyanko is with us, head of the Ukrainian Center for Security and Cooperation.